In the early hours of a cold winter morning, several radar dots appear over the Arctic Circle. They are moving under stormy skies, lumbering foreign beasts carrying a deadly cargo bound for the west. NORAD scrambles bomber interceptors to get into the sky, but the call doesn't go to the American air bases, but rather to their friendly neighbour to the north and to their incredible home-built aircraft. The Avro Arrow. Pushing the throttle to reach over Mach 2, these Canadian interceptors have been specially bred to hunt out the greatest menace of the 60s, Soviet nuclear bombers. Armed with twin 1.5 megaton nuclear rockets, these jets have the speed and firepower to catch up and wipe out any bombing run attempt over the North Pole. Yet this jet never entered active service. No plane was more well built, no jet more superior, and no story more tragic than the Avro Arrow. Many Canadians believe that this aircraft was so advanced for its time that even 40 years later it was still being considered for modern defence. But just before its maiden launch, the entire project was cancelled, scrapped, and the prototypes destroyed, seemingly without warning, and over 30,000 workers lost their jobs. This is the tragic, legendary story of the Canadian jet, the Avro Arrow. At the end of the Second World War, the West was terrified to discover that the Soviets were starting to develop a fleet of high-altitude, long-range bomber aircraft, many of which would carry nuclear weapons. These new unstoppable aircraft would be able to fly directly over the North Pole and hit targets in Western Europe and North America. Naturally, the West needed a counter-aircraft, a bomber interceptor. These planes would be small, fast, and designed to catch up to their bombers and take them out well before they entered friendly airspace. The US had several aircraft to fill this role, such as the North American F-86D Sabre, followed by the Northrop F-89 Scorpion, and eventually in the late 50s, the Convair F-106 Delta Dart. Looking at the world stage, however, you might notice a not-so-small nation lay right between the heart of capitalism and the USSR, Canada. Canada had effectively taken on a new role as Defender of the North, falling under a flight path of Soviet bombers, and it was about time it had its own aircraft to help protect its airspace. This is what they came up with. The jet would officially be called the CF-105 Arrow, built by Canadian aircraft manufacturer Avro Canada, which is better known today as Avro. It was designed with a crew of two in mind, sitting in tandem with one behind the other. The plane would be 77 feet long, which is 23.8 meters, and a height of 21 feet, which is a bit over 6 meters. The wings would be a delta shape designed for speed and have a wingspan of exactly 50 feet, or 15 meters, which is a very nice round number. It would have had many of the same advantages of the swept wing in terms of transonic and supersonic performance, but offered much more internal room and overall surface area, useful for fuel tanks and more lift when flying at serious speeds. And let's talk about that speed. The aircraft was designed to be deployed fast and catch up to the best that the Soviets could throw at the West. It would have a top speed of 1,136 knots, which is 1,307 miles per hour or 2,104 kilometers per hour, with some modifications to push it well into Mach 2 territory. Armament was stored in a large internal bay located in the belly position of the aircraft, taking up over 1/3 of the aircraft fuselage. A wide variety of weapons could be deployed from this bay, such as the Hughes Falcon guided missile, the Velvet Glove air-to-air missile, or 4 general-purpose 1,000-pound bombs. Because of the shape, the front wheel was long and thin and had to fit snugly under the nose, an engineering marvel for the time. The bomber interceptor would have a combat range of 360 nautical miles, around about 670 kilometers. or if out just on a little patrol, a top range of around 718 nautical miles, which is 1,330 kilometers. Naturally, there were plans to fit the aircraft with additional fuel tanks where needed, but as it was a defense fighter, it wouldn't have to go very far from the airbase. It wouldn't be exactly fantastic at dogfighting with other jets or being used on air-to-surface bombing raids due to the drag and delta wings at lower speeds, but as a bomber interceptor designed to fly fast and in a straight line, it fit the bill with flying colours and was considered one of the best, if not the best, bomber interceptor ever designed. But developing a home-built superior bomber interceptor wouldn't be easy, and overcoming the technological challenges and insurmountable political ones would prove to be impossible. But to understand the downfall of the Avro Arrow, we need to start where it all began. It's quite funny because our story actually begins with a completely different aircraft, the Avro CF-100 Canuck all-weather interceptor. Entering into service in 1953, the plane would go on to be a highly ordered and utilised aircraft by the Canadian Armed Forces, something that I'll cover in a future video for sure. It was built by a little company called Avro Canada that was a subsidiary of the Hawker Siddeley Group. Because the Canuck had a troubled prototype development that led to several delays, the Royal Canadian Air Force realised that they would need to start working on a successor to the Canuck even before it rolled off the production line. And this new design would need to be able to carry missiles and fly fast to match the latest jet-powered bombers of the Soviet Union, like the mysterious, perhaps even nuclear-powered M50. In 1952, a year before the Canuck took on military colours, the RCAF issued a special report highlighting the requirements for a new second-generation interceptor called the Air 7-3. This new aircraft would need to carry 2 crew, have twin engines, and a range of at least 300 nautical miles, 556 kilometers for those using metric, for low-speed missions, as well as a short 200 nautical miles range when it was flying at top speed. It would also be able to fly at Mach 1.5 at an altitude of 70,000 feet, and be able to turn at 2 Gs without a loss of speed. All of this within 5 minutes of taking off from a runway as short as 6,000 feet, or 1,830 meters. If these specs sound daunting, then you would be right. No such jet with that capability existed at the time. The RCAF would send out a team led by Ray Footit to find a suitable aircraft. He looked at US aircraft producers such as Boeing and Lockheed, as well as British and French design. But no existing nor planned plane filled these ambitious targets. So they turned to homegrown Avro engineering to come up with a dream machine. Originally, they proposed an improvement to the Canuck for its supersonic flight when performing a dive, but these would not cut it and would require them to start from the ground up. In May of 1953, Avro submitted the first designs of the Arrow. It was radical and included new shoulder-mounted wing design to allow rapid access to the aircraft's internals, weapons bay and engines, and a new design to be more simple and constructed separately, speeding up production. Originally, the government wanted to just proceed with a full design study for around 27 million Canadian, but when news broke that the Soviets had a breakthrough with jet bomber technology, such as the M4 Bison, as well as the hydrogen bomb armament that it carried, the Canadians changed their tune to the order of 260 million, over $2 billion today, for 5 flight-ready Avro Arrows. The race to design the jet of the future was on. To meet the rapid rollout plans of the Canadian government, as in to have the plane flying by earliest 1955, Avro Engineering planned to build the production line first, rather than hand-build prototypes. This was more risky and harder to engineer and expensive, but it would allow them to instantly roll out production models when the design was finalized. James Floyd, the Vice President of Engineering at Avro, noted, "It was decided to take the technical risks involved to save time on the program. I will not pretend that this philosophy of production type build from the outset did not cause a lot of us problems in engineering. However, it did achieve its objective." By 1954, wind tunnel tests had begun, with early computer simulations used in both Canada and the United States to test the flight model. They even used models of the design attached to the end of rockets launched by NASA to determine how they would fly at Mach 1.7. These tests revealed several flaws, such as changing the leading edge of the wing and adding a small dogtooth to the middle of the wing right here to control span-wise airflow at high speeds. Material science for the design was also finalized, using mostly a blend of magnesium and titanium, although the latter was only used sparingly around the engines and the fastenings as the material back then was so darn expensive, plus reserved for a different American project, the SR-71 spy plane. The consulting test pilots also complained there was a lack of control feel in the design, as the stick wasn't actually connected to any control surfaces, using fly-by-wire technology instead. Thus, the engineers created a small control box that applied hydraulic pressure back to the stick, making it move slightly when pressure was applied to the wings, giving the pilots an artificial feel, a world first. But it was around this time that the program was hit by its first major delay. Its selected engine and its backup engine were both cancelled, leaving the plane nothing more than a giant titanium paperweight. By the start of 1955, both the RB-106 engine design and the Wright J67 engine had been cancelled, leaving the team high and dry. They had to swap in for a technically unsuitable Pratt & Whitney J75 engine, which I'll get to in a minute, used in the Lockheed U-2 for the initial test models, with plans to swap them out with a homemade design when production of the real plane started. This engine was more heavy and would throw out the center of gravity of the jet, meaning the engineers had to put in actual weight into the nose of the plane, increasing the cost to operate. But this wouldn't be the only issue that would pop up. In 1956, when evaluating the full-scale mock-ups, the RCAF demanded additional changes to the design. They wanted a state-of-the-art US targeting system for a new Sparrow 2 missile, both of which hadn't even left the drawing board yet, as opposed to the existing MX-1179 targeting system for the Falcon rocket. This was a substantial and very expensive change, with Avro complaining that it would delay the program further. And wouldn't you know it, just like the engines, the US targeting system and Sparrow 2 missiles were cancelled only a year later. The Canadian government had to step in, take over the project from the US Navy's hands, and see it to completion to save face. This might have all faded into the past when the first test airframe rolled out of the hangar on October 4th, 1957 to large crowds. Well, proposed large crowds. You see, only a few of the 13,000 attendees showed up because the Russians had launched the first satellite Sputnik that very same day. Talk about bad timing. The test unit had no fire control systems, as it wasn't yet ready, and thus the weapons bay and other areas like the nose had replaced or been filled by weights to replicate the true feel of the aircraft. But this didn't stop the airframe taking off into the sky on March 25th, 1958, and in a huge sigh of relief, proved no major design flaws. The CF-105 Avro Arrow demonstrated excellent handling and was able to go supersonic on its third flight, breaking records by going over 1,600 kilometers per hour whilst climbing and even hitting a top speed of Mach 1.98, smugly reported as not even realizing its true power. Test pilot Jack Woodman, the only pilot to ever fly the Arrow, reported the aircraft at supersonic speeds was pleasant and easy to fly. During approach and landing, the handling characteristics were considered good. He would even go on to say that excellent progress was being made in the development. From where I sat, the Arrow was performing as predicted and was meeting all guarantees. It seems that the jet of the future had finally arrived and the world would change forever. Well, almost. What happens next is one of the most controversial choices ever done in the history of aviation, and I commend you to hold your color as we ride this political roller coaster. Now, the last 15 minutes I have painted a wonderful picture of unity amongst Canada's military engineers and armed forces. However, this wasn't exactly the case. You see, while the Air Force loved the Arrow, the Army and Navy were a little bit jealous that so much money was being diverted into this project. The generals put political pressure on the program, petitioning it to be scrapped at the earliest opportunity. To put things into perspective, by the end of the development of the Arrow, it was taking up around about 20 to 30% of the entire military budget of Canada. There was also an argument that perhaps the focus had been in the wrong direction. The Russians had proved spaceflight was possible, and perhaps next there would be rockets heading to Canada from orbit, rather than flying over the Arctic Circle on board bombers. Terrified of a possible missile gap, the new government of Canada in 1957 signed the NORAD Treaty, a combined defense of North America with the USA. Keeping in mind its own interests in the aerospace industry, the US put pressure on Canada to discontinue the Arrow and instead allow it to access the Bomark nuclear-tipped anti-aircraft missile instead. And thus, they wouldn't need a bomber interceptor of their own, they would just blow everything out of the sky. But these new nuclear-tipped missiles wouldn't be cheap, and costing a fortune, this would mean that the government would need to choose between the Avro Arrow or the new anti-ballistic missile system from the USA, a part of its treaty with NORAD. You can kind of see where this is going. On the 11th of August 1958, the government made a move to cancel the Arrow in favour of these new missiles. The Cabinet Defence Committee of Canada refused and demanded that they wait until a major review on the 31st of March 1959 could be completed. But alas, by September, the government got their way and their order for their Arrows was stopped. The Canadian government would go on to order the Bomark missiles instead. As a stopgap, the Avro team tried to sell the Arrow to England. Initially, there was a chance that they might order up to 144 Arrows to fill in a void until their own aircraft, the F-155, could be completed. This version of the Arrow would be powered by UK engines, the Bristol Olympus 7R, and built in the UK, leading to plenty of jobs. But with the Arrow unlikely to be up and running until 1962 at this point, and the F-155 due in 1963, it did seem kinda pointless. They also tried to sell it to the French government, or at least the engines that they had developed to power it. But when media rumours circulated that the Canadian government was going to cancel the engine program, the French stopped negotiating. Avro tried to go private and sell the engines anyway themselves, but they were blocked from being considered. Lastly, the US, who had been watching the program with great interest, would go on to choose their own Convair F-106 Delta Dart that looks kind of very similar to the Arrow. With the Soviets now pressing full steam ahead into ICBM technology and the various world governments felt at the time the Arrow had passed, they all passed on the program. This would end up being the killing blow for the program, and it was officially cancelled on the 20th of February 1959. The effects of the cancellation were immediate. 14,500 Avro employees, as well as 15,000 others who depended on the business of the supply chain of the Arrow, were suddenly out of work. Apparently, the management at the time, revealed later, was caught out by this news and only found out by the newspaper of the Arrow's cancelling that very day. They were shocked and planned to win over more than just Canada's business by that March review, where the first Arrow Mk2 would have rolled out and taken to the skies to smash both world speed and altitude records. They never got a chance to change the world of aviation, only by a matter of a few weeks. In a last-ditch effort to save something, anything of their program, they insisted that the completed prototypes be donated to the Research High-Speed Flight Department of the Canadian government. The government refused, as they lacked the spare parts nor the pilots to use the aircraft if the program was shut down. They even tried to ship one aircraft to England to be used at Boscombe Down, but they didn't get permission. The government swept in, and within 2 months, all aircraft, engines, production machines, and blueprints were completely and utterly destroyed. Officially, the command was given to prevent secret materials from being leaked to the Soviets, which actually has some truth, as spying efforts were proved by the Russians many years later after the fall of the USSR. There were other rumours that the manager of Avro Canada, W.A. Curtis, flew away one of the completed prototypes and hid it deep within the Rockies somewhere. We can't prove it ever happened, but he took that secret with him to his grave, and the story became a legend. The fallout of the program was far-reaching and marked an end of an era to aerospace work in Canada. Engineers drained from the country, going to work at NASA and eventually resulting in the moon landings, and others, just like James Floyd, going to work in the United Kingdom on their own special version of a supersonic transport concept, eventually resulting in the Concorde. Back at home, the government would double down on their betrayal and order 66 McDonnell CF-101 Voodoo aircraft in 1961, only 3 years after the cancellation of the Arrow. It was such a controversial move that it led to the government coalition breaking apart only 2 years later. At the time, aviation commentator Bill Guston said, "In its planning, design, and flight test program, this fighter, in almost every way the most advanced fighters of the 1950s, was impressive and successful as any aircraft in history," and thus ended a dark chapter of aviation in not only Canada, but for the whole world. The Avro Arrow was a remarkable aircraft, and so ahead of its time that it was still even under consideration in 2012 as a rival possibility to the F-35. Had it survived this political instability, it is very likely it would have become the fighter plane of choice of England, Europe, and perhaps even beating those in the USA for a time. Avro had big plans for the design. With the kinks worked out of the Mark I version, they planned to roll out the new engines to the Mark II and be able to fly faster than anything else ever built at the time, well over Mach 2. But why stop there? They also believed that they would build a Mark III version that would be able to fly at a speed of the very same number, Mach 3, and beat even the upcoming MiG-25. It would have been able to carry more weapons and fly up to a height of 70,000 feet. From here, this aircraft would have propelled the Canadian aerospace industry, resulting in everything from bigger and better commercial airliners, perhaps even a decade ahead of their American equivalent, to even a Canadian space program. If the company had been left alone to continue the development process, Canada would have had a man on the moon, said Rob Cohen, CEO of the Canadian Air and Space Museum. But this future never happened, and today you can only find scraps of the design around several museums. The airframe of possibly the most advanced aircraft has long been sought after, and it's only thanks to a few people like senior draftsman Ken Barnes, who held onto the blueprints for decades, keeping them hidden in a safe, that we can finally get a detailed look at what could have been. There are now various full-scale and model replicas found in museums across the country, and the aircraft's legacy has been cemented in the general consciousness of the country. For Canadians, the Arrow is more than a simple jet fighter. It is a symbol of pride of their engineering prowess, their homegrown ingenuity, and their drive to create possibly the greatest aviation aircraft the world has ever seen. It was lightning in a bottle, and perhaps we may never see its like again. While many hailed the Arrow as a miracle of engineering, it was a program plagued by cost overruns, delays, too many cooks in the kitchen, and a role that was increasingly diminished. The world didn't need any bomber interceptors, it needed a way to combat nuclear missiles. Plus, with only a short range, Canada would need 300 Arrows to defend its territory, a cost that was astronomical back then. And with said costs mounting up to 20 to 30% of the entire military budget of Canada for a single plane, they made a choice that on paper made perfect sense. A lot of romantics might say that it wasn't the right idea, and then in retrospective, the move by the government was bad, but at the time, we should suggest that they were between a rock and a hard place, and this move was seen as the lesser of two evils. What do you think? Let me know down in the comments if you think they did the right choice. I read all the comments for this video and I want to know what you think, especially if you're Canadian. Was it right for the government to get rid of the Arrow, or do you think it should have remained? This video is already my longest ever, and for those that have been demanding that I do the Arrow, I hope that you have enjoyed the journey with me today. If you want to find your own way to support the channel and not be like the Canadian government, then you can either be a channel member right here by clicking the join button, or you can become a Patreon, both where you'll get to see new videos early, see behind the scenes, chat directly with me, and even choose topics just like this one. So jump on and check it out. And again, if you've just come to the channel, give this video a like and a subscribe, and thank you so much for watching my little video today.